Good morning. My name is Kathy Herms, and I'm in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science at the Ohio State University OERDC, and I do research on weeds and organic and conventional systems. And I appreciate the opportunity this morning to talk with you about one of my favorite topics, which is how can we use biological principles to guide our approach to the sustainable management of weeds. And so just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. First, we'll go over weed definitions. We'll then do a little bit of plant biology 101 refresher and talk about some important basics. We'll discuss common characteristics of weeds. We'll then talk about the soil weed seed bank, and we'll use that knowledge and apply it to biologically based tactics for controlling weeds in our yards. Then I'll present you with a few weedy scenarios just to kind of to ground truth it and put it in real time with something that can happen in our gardens. I'll have you consider the good of weeds and then present you with a few resources that might be of some use. Okay, so working definition, what is a weed? There's many definitions, and some definitions are objective and some are subjective. So a plant good at thriving in frequently disturbed sites. That describes the corn and soybean field and the weeds that we'll encounter there. Another definition could be a plant growing in our garden that we didn't plant. So that I would consider as a volunteer. We all have those, like, where did this come from? I didn't plant it. Not sure if it's what we want or not, but it's a volunteer. And then it's any plant growing where we don't want it to grow. And in there, it's more of a value judgment. It's a plant out of place. So maybe if it was growing in another spot, it might be okay. And one of my favorite definitions, any plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered, by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So no matter what definition we want to use, know that weeds can be both native and non-native plants. I have both the native wingstem and the non-native lemon balm in my yard, and both are what I consider weeds at times. And when we think of weeds, we usually think of harm that weeds can do. And one of the main negative impacts of weeds are to reduce yield of whatever crop it is that we're growing. And weeds do this by competing really well for resources, light, water, nutrients. And some weeds also produce chemicals in their roots that can inhibit or deter nearby plants. Weeds can physically interfere with mechanical or agricultural operations. They can gum up the combine. Weeds can harbor pathogenic organisms, and they can also be toxic or allergenic to animals and humans. And we all know when common ragweed season comes and the pollen, we either suffer or we have friends who suffer. So I'd like to talk about how it's critical to understand the biology of the weeds that are in our yards, the specific species, and that will help us determine the most effective control strategies. In order to do that, we're just going to go over a little bit of weed biology or plant biology basics. So first, for plants, there's two main types: monocots or grasses. And grasses, they have one cotyledon or seed leaf. They have parallel leaf venation, and they have a fibrous root system. Dicots, also known as broadleaves, have two cotyledons or seed leaves. They have nut-like leaf venation, and they have a taproot with secondary roots. So predominantly, pretty much all the weeds in our yard, the plants in our yard, fall into these two main types. And then we can categorize the weeds into different life cycles. So we have annual weeds, which complete their life cycle all in 1 year. And those annual weeds can be grasses and broadleaves. And we have most of the annuals that we encounter are summer annuals. They germinate in the spring, in the summer. They go to flower, they set seed, and they die before the winter. But some annuals actually behave as what we call a winter annual. They're going to germinate in the late summer and fall. They're going to overwinter as a rosette. And then in the early spring, when things are just starting to warm up, they're going to send up a flower stalk, they're going to form seeds, and they're going to reproduce before we really haven't even gotten into our gardens. And then we have biennials, and biennials are only broadleaf plants. There are no grass biennials, at least not in our area. And these are plants that take 2 years to complete their life cycle. And a common example is Queen Anne's lace. It forms a rosette the first year, that rosette overwinters. The second year it bolts and sends up a flower stalk and produces seeds and dies. And then another type, or third type of life cycle, is a perennial. And perennials die back to the ground during the winter, but the roots and the underground structures remain alive. So then in the spring, they can send up shoots from those root structures or those crowns. And perennials usually live more than 2 years. So what kind of reproduction? That's another thing that we need to know about. So annual and biennial weeds, they reproduce mostly by seeds. They have flowers, they set seed. We have Jimson weed on the bottom, which is an annual, and we have bolt thistle on the right. And it forms fluffy seed heads similar to the dandelion. When we think of perennial weeds, they can reproduce by seeds, but they also can reproduce by vegetative reproduction. And let's dig a little bit more into what that is. Okay, so there's several different types of vegetative reproduction. So one type is the production of stems either underground or on the surface or near the surface of the soil that can send up nodes or send up new sprouts periodically and root and form new plants. So in the case of underground stems, they're rhizome, we call them rhizomes. And you can see this picture of yellow nutsedge. It looks like a root there with the roots that are out, and then it's got a rhizome connecting the two plants, but it's technically a stem. And then you have strawberries, and strawberries have those runners that we all know about. Those are surface stems that are also called stolons that root at the nodes and can form new plants. So that's sort of one form of vegetative reproduction. But then you also have perennials can form bulbs, tubers, and or corms. And here's the case of lesser celandine and yellow nutsedge producing tubers, and each one of those tubers can form a new independent plant. And then another interesting way of vegetative reproduction is aerial bulbs or bulbils. And wild garlic does this, and lesser celandine does this. And they're going to be producing these bulbils in leaf axils, or in this case for wild garlic as part of the seed head, but instead of producing seeds, it's producing bulbils. Okay, so let's talk about some common characteristics of weeds. So weeds technically or generally are pioneer species, colonizers of disturbed habitat. So they have rapid seed germination in bare soil. They also have rapid growth and reproduction and can use a lot of nutrients, which makes them grow fast and grow big. They can also be tolerant to stress. This could be low or excessive soil nutrients. It could be drought or flooding. It could be temperature extremes. It could be repeated disturbance like what we have in our farm fields. Another common characteristic of weeds is that they produce lots of seeds and or vegetative propagules. So we talked about the bulbils for the wild garlic, which is that's pictured here again. That wild garlic is forming both bulbils and seeds in that seed head. And then on the other side, we have a pigweed seed head, and that can produce over 100,000 seeds in just that one flower stalk. Another characteristic of weeds is that they have features that promote their dispersal. So one common form of dispersal that we think of is the dandelion seeds blowing in the wind. Another is the hitchhiker, the burdock burrs that get stuck in your fleece or in your dog's fur. We can also have weeds hitchhiking by being eaten by animals going through the digestive tract and then being deposited somewhere else with the seed still intact. Weeds can be dispersed by water. And then a form of short distance dispersal is seed expulsion or seed propulsion, where the seed coat violently erupts and propels the seeds out, and they go several feet or more away from the parent plant. But when we think about the dispersal, let's not forget that humans are also agents of dispersal for weeds. So weeds that have great ornamental use, beautiful flowers, very tolerant, those are going to be spread widely by humans because they are something that everybody wants in their garden. And then we can have weeds dispersed in contaminated materials and tools. So we might get an order of mulch, we might get some soil, or we might have a shovel that we've dug in different parts of our garden, and the weed seeds can stick in the soil that's on that shovel and move around. So a few more characteristics of weeds: their ability to grow from root pieces or stem fragments. So I don't know if any of you have had experience with common purslane, which is a summer annual, but you weed it and you think you throw it in a pile and you think it's done, but those stem fragments can actually root and form new plants. And weeds can also do chemical defenses, like we talked about earlier, through their root systems and deter other plants around. And then another key factor of weeds is seed dormancy and longevity of seeds in the soil. So let's go into that just a little bit more. So we have what's called the soil weed seed bank. And what that is the seeds that were produced last year and dropped onto the soil, plus seeds that are surviving in the soil from previous years, and seeds that are brought in from afar via dispersal. And why is the seed bank important? The seed bank is important because it's like a long-term weed memory. So in this case, this is a velvet leaf plant. The adult plant produced seeds and died, let's say 10 years ago. But those seeds can stay in the soil and stay viable, so that if there's a disturbance event and the conditions are right, those offspring can germinate way after the parent plant has gone. And so this is a mechanism of one of the mechanisms of dormancy. So if the seed is too deep, if there's too much shade, if it's too hot, if it's too dry, if there's certain conditions, the seed can just sort of hang out and not germinate until the conditions are right. And then these seeds are protected with a seed coat. They're so tiny, but they can actually stay in the soil. Many of these species, like velvet leaf, can stay viable in the soil for 50+ years. So the seed bank is very important. So now let's apply what we've just talked about with weed biology to tactics for controlling weeds. Let's see how those apply. So we always talk about, first, you want to prevent. So we have and anything you can do to prevent the problem before it happens. So one thing I always do in my yard, is best I can, but I'm never perfect with this, but I try not to let a weed go to seed. So if there's some weeds that are really bothersome to me, I try not to let those seeds shed. I try to do something to prevent the plants from forming seeds. And I also don't want to let weeds get their foot in the door, like the Canada thistle there. You get one plant maybe 1 year that comes in with your mulch, and then by next year, if you don't do anything about it, you've got like a whole patch. So you want to get at them soon. You want to be vigilant and do a rapid response. Then you want to watch for contamination. So last year, my husband and I got a load of topsoil, and we spread it along our driveway, along the edges of our driveway, and it was filled with burdock weeds. And I didn't have burdock on my property before that, or at least not in that density. And so that's something now that I'm dealing with. So other tactics for prevention, it's important to be aware of your surroundings, of your yard, and of the garden in particular. So one of the common ways for weeds to get into our gardens is what I call edge creepers. And this is a picture of ground ivy moving in from the grass into a bed. Not the best picture, but that's one of the common ways that ground ivy will get into my bed, and also clover. But then also know that seeds can disperse from a pretty long distance. So let's say you have a farmer across the street and he has some horseweed in his fields. They go to seed, he doesn't get them controlled in time, and the winds are just right, and they're going to blow those seeds to your yard. And so now you're going to have horseweed potentially. Some other tactics for prevention are to limit bare soil and limit soil disturbance. We talked about weeds as being colonizers of disturbed areas, those pioneer species. And so anything we can do to limit that, that perfect habitat, that clean slate for the weeds. And also when we do soil disturbance, there's a chance that we're going to bring seeds up that are buried down in the soil that are dormant. And if we bring them up closer to the surface, now they might have conditions that are favorable for germination. Another good tactic for prevention are weed barriers. So we have ground cloth or landscape fabric. You can use mulch, stone, newspaper. And a couple other tactics that you can consider, the use of cover crops and green manures. So you could plant a cover crop after you're done in your garden for the fall. You can plant an oat cover crop. It's going to winter kill, but the residue that's then there left over is going to help keep those early germinating weeds at bay, those winter annuals and those early summer germinating annuals. And then you can also, let's say in the spring, you decide you wanted to plant some buckwheat. You can grow that for a short amount of time, and then when you're ready, when it starts to flower, you can mow it. You can work the buckwheat biomass into the soil, and a couple weeks later, you can plant into it. You can also help by getting a head start with your crops and getting healthy transplants that are going to be very competitive right out of the gate, right when you get them planted in the ground, so they compete with the weeds. Okay, so inevitably we are going to have weeds that are going to get established and get out of hand. And so then we have to consider control strategies as well. So of course we have the tried and true mechanical strategies of mowing, cutting, weed whacking. That can work really well if you have annual weeds that are flowering. You know you're not going to be able to get in there to pull them out. You can just cut their flower heads off and prevent them from at least going to seed, because then you know if they're annuals, they're just going to die. If it's a perennial, mowing and cutting can actually, if you do that periodically, you can help exhaust the root system, and maybe eventually the perennial will get out-competed by all the other vegetation. Frequent soil disturbance can also help with perennials, and if you have big flushes of weed seedlings. And then another tactic that's probably used more in agriculture, more so than in our gardens, is soil inversion. And this is where you're actually using an implement to flip the soil over 6 to 8 inches. And so let's say you had a big flush of foxtail germination on the surface of your garden. You can invert the soil. So now all those foxtail seeds that were on the surface are buried 6 to 8 inches down, too deep for them to germinate. Okay, some other tactics for control. There are some organically approved herbicides And OMRI.org it stands for the Organic Materials Review Institute. It's an organization that actually evaluates and determines which products are going to be okay for organic production. And so this is a great resource if you want to look for different products that might be okay to try in your yard. And also another tactic could be the stale seed bed. This is a little bit more involved, but it could be very useful depending on your situation. So what you do is in the spring, you allow the first flush of weeds to come up. And when they're still very small, we call that the white thread stage. We can barely see the cotyledons, and then just the little white thread of the root, the radicle, you want to cultivate, and that's going to kill those weeds. And then after a couple weeks, you're going to have another flush of weeds, and so you're going to cultivate again. And maybe if you get a dry spell, you can irrigate to stimulate more germination. Essentially, what you're doing is you're trying to exhaust the seeds that were going to germinate for that season. You're going to try to kind of flush them out ahead of time, and then you're going to plant as late as you can. So we call that a stale seed bed approach. Couple more tactics. Dense crop spacing. You don't want to give any room for the weeds. And then smother crops. We talked about cover crops for prevention. You can also use those same crops to help smother weeds out. And some cover crops, especially grains and mustards, have allelopathic compounds in their roots that will deter weeds. So you can use that allelopathy to your advantage. Okay, let us talk about some scenarios. So let's have a winter annual scenario. Your vegetable plot has a solid cover of hairy bittercress, which is a winter annual, and it's flowering right now. In late April, you decide you want to prep the garden, so you get in there and you start pulling the bittercress. After a minute, you realize that pulling is not going to help. And what did you notice? So bittercress, knowing that it's a winter annual, we know that it flowers and it goes to seed very early in the spring. And so what happened was you waited a little bit too long to get in there and pull the bittercress. And even though you thought the seed pods weren't completely ripe yet, bittercress has the ability to violently dehiss the seeds, eject the seeds. And so those seed pods are actually, they're mature. And every time you just brush up against the bittercress as you're trying to weed them, the seeds go all flying through the air and depositing on the soil. So no matter what you do, whatever kind of mechanical control you're going to do for that, you're going to burst all of those seed pods and the seeds are just going to go on the soil. At that point, you've lost the battle and you have to come up with another strategy and know that, okay, maybe I'm going to use cover crops or mulch in the fall to try to prevent those winter annuals from germinating in the fall. Okay, so let's look at a perennial scenario. So you order some mulch in the spring for your flower beds. And a few days after spreading, you see a few tiny little nut sedge starting to grow, but they're so tiny and you're so busy with all the other stuff in your yard that you just wait to weed them. And after a few weeks, the nut sedge are getting pretty big and you think, okay, I'm going to pull them out now. And then another week or so after you do that, you see more nut sedge coming up in the same spot. So what happened? Well, if we think about it, nut sedge is a perennial and it spreads by seeds, rhizomes, and tubers. And even though the plants hadn't gone to flower, they may have gotten big enough to actually form tubers and rhizomes. So when you pulled the plants out, you left some of that rhizome and tuber material behind that could form new plants. And so knowing this, what you want to do is say, okay, next time I see nut sedge, as soon as I see it, I'm going to pull it out because I don't want it to get a foot in the door. I don't want it to get to that point where it can leave vegetative reproductive structures in the soil. Okay, let's think of a seed bank scenario. So you've been using landscape fabric for a couple of years with good success. And then you decide this year you want to improve your soil health. So you remove the fabric and incorporate some compost with your neighbor's heavy duty cultivator. And then you decide to go fabric free for this year. And a few weeks later, you see a ton of weed seeds germinating. And you don't understand because you've been using the landscape fabric for several years. You haven't had any weed escapes. You haven't had any problems. So why are there so many seeds germinating? Well, there's several potential answers to this. And the first thing could be that removing the fabric and changing the environmental conditions, you actually stimulated weed germination. We talk about the weed seeds having dormancy. And so maybe you ended up by increasing the light, changing the temperature, the humidity. When you remove that fabric, you're actually stimulating weeds that were down in there in the soil, just waiting until the right conditions. It's possible you got compost that was contaminated. So that's definitely, you always need to think about that. And then another option is that when you cultivated pretty deep with that cultivator, and you brought some soil up from deeper down, and with it, dormant seeds that now are on the surface and in a better condition to germinate. So you've awakened the seed bank. You stirred up the seed bank, so to speak. And those are all potential explanations for what happened. And maybe it's more than one. And knowing this now, maybe this will help you to decide your steps and planning appropriately if you can anticipate that you're going to have a problem in future years when you're doing these kinds of changes in your garden. Okay, so I know there was a lot to cover, but just kind of starting to wrap up. So understanding the biology of the weeds that are in our yards, the specific species, will help us determine the best control strategies. And we need to consider the right tool and strategy for the job. That's critical. But also critical is the timing. Just like the bitter crust, we waited a little bit too long. Or the yellow nutsedge, we waited a little bit too long. And then we need to be realistic with our expectations. None of these tactics are going to be a silver bullet. So likely you're going to have to use more than one tactic. And then imagine you've got a diversity of weeds in your yard. They have different life cycles, different modes of reproduction, different densities in the seed bank. So you're going to need to use a suite of tactics throughout your garden to try to control all of these different weed species and get them to a tolerable level. I just want to kind of throw out there and kind of challenge our thinking that we talked about weeds being bad, but weeds can actually have a good side. There's an upside to weeds, and they can actually reduce soil erosion and conserve soil moisture. They can add soil organic matter and nutrients to the soil with their roots, and if they concentrate nutrients or fix nitrogen like legumes. Weeds can also harbor beneficial enemies that are going to be maybe useful to keeping pest insects away from our crops. And weeds can provide food for native fauna. And so, one of the common weeds that I get people to call me about is stinging nettle. And I don't know if any of you have had this in your garden, but it definitely is a surprise when you encounter it and if you're weeding or going through your garden. And most people's immediate reaction is, we got to get this out of here. But consider that the stinging nettle is a larval host plant for the red admiral butterfly. And so maybe think about, are there places in your yard where you could tolerate the stinging nettle? And are there certain places for certain weeds where you can leave them and tolerate them because they are beneficial to other organisms that you're trying to enhance? You have a butterfly garden. You want red admiral butterflies, the adults, to come to your flowers. But then it would be also good to have the larval host plants. So it's just something to consider. Some weed ID resources. There are a lot of resources out there. I am a tried and true. I love my paperback. I love my hard copy ID guides. And probably one of the best ones, if you're just going to buy one, is the Weeds of the Northeast. I think it covers most of the species we're going to have in our area. There are a lot of weed ID phone apps that are coming on now, and I've tried one of them and it was actually quite good. I tried to fool it, and it worked out. It was impressive. It worked out better than I thought it would. There's also, we have the Ohio Perennial and Biennial Weed Guide on the OERDC website. Though it doesn't have annuals, it has really good descriptions and pictures for biennials and perennials that will help you with ID. Some other resources, the Ohio State University's OFFER website, the Organic Food and Farming Education and Research program, has an organic weed management website that has got a lot of useful information. And we talked about the OMRI organization, that's the Organic Materials Review Institute. They evaluate all of the products for potential use in organic settings. So if you're considering some kind of product and you're not sure if it's sustainable and what you want to use, you can look and see if it's listed in the OMRI list. So that's a really useful website. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity. This is a huge topic and there's so much to talk about with it. And I think we just scratched the surface, but hopefully I've provided you with some information and some tools that will be helpful to you as you go through the season. And like I always like to say, if you can't beat them, eat them. So thank you so much and happy gardening.
If you have a question, go ahead and stick it in the chat. And I see a couple nice comments. Someone commented that stinging nettle also makes a nice herbal tea. And I was talking to someone before the session began about eating some dandelion greens and other uses for dandelions. So you can have some fun with your weed ID too. So I do have a question here. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I will throw this one to Paul. What is the best way to control creeping perennials like English ivy and pachysandra?
So the best way that I have found, in large patches of those things is just simply to grub them out like you would sod. So they don't have a really deep root system, so it's easy to get underneath of them with, like a spade and just strip them off like you would sod in any part of your yard or garden. And then you might on occasion, especially with pachysandra, have a few shoots here and there that would pop back up from maybe some root pieces that got left, and those are really easy to just hand pull and just keep depleting what's coming up.
Thanks, Paul. A couple questions on the chat about getting a copy of the presentation. And yes, I will post that on the website probably by the end of the day today, so you can come back and reference that. The question from Mari: my aconites are taking over. Tolerate or remove entirely?
Well, Mari, that's completely up to you. Every good person has a different definition of what is a weed. So if it's considered a weed to you now because they're taking over, then yeah, you might want to go through and thin them out. Maybe just dig up some of the bulbs right now because it's easy to find them while there's still foliage on the plant. And be careful not to let those little bulblets drop to other parts of your garden where they could establish. But yeah, it's perfectly fine if you need to remove them, to go ahead and remove them.
I think we've all probably planted something that we later regret that's taking over the yard. So.
Yep.
Any other questions? I know something that didn't come up in the presentation was kind of like in controlling those creeping perennials. I know there's that can kind of be a dance of good timing as well, where you're trying to get it when it's at its lowest. It's storing all those carbohydrates and energy underground. And what are the best time of the year to kind of attack those kinds of plants and take advantage of those low reserves?
Is that a question for me, Cass?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it differs on each weed, but they're going to have the most reserves definitely in the fall. So summer going into fall, and then in the early spring as they're coming out of dormancy. So if you're trying to control those without worrying about the carbohydrate store, anytime after that, so mid to or early to midsummer, late spring, you know, if they've got significant top growth to them, they're not going to have those carbohydrates in the roots.
When you want to be outside anyway.
Right. Yep. Perfect time to garden.
Has anyone used a weed wrench? I've never heard of this. Caroline, you can unmute and kind of talk a little bit about it, kind of what it is if you want.
I'm desperate to get rid of this one. I think it's Japanese burberry. It's got really nasty prickers and it's spreading like crazy over my 5 acres. And I had read it's hard to get out. The bottom actually comes out easily, but to get the pricker branches off first is the hard part. So I'd read that a weed wrench was useful. I just didn't know if anyone had used one. Thanks for letting me ask.
I am not familiar with that tool. We have and it could be similar. It's like a grapple with some teeth and spring-loaded to remove woody ornamentals or invasives that you can hook to chain behind a tractor or a loader or something and rip things out that way, and it brings up most of the roots.
Yep.
All right, question about Canada thistle taking over strawberry beds. I would just keep trying to deplete those resources. Canada thistle trying to control organically is difficult and it takes a long time. As soon as you see the shoots popping up, just keep pulling them out. Yeah, it's for a while it's going to make more shoots come up, but eventually you'll be able to deplete those energy reserves and hopefully defeat it. Some other methods, like Kathy talked about, try to, increase the planting density to help shade that, use a mulch to help suppress the plant, to, whether that's a fabric mulch or even, like a straw or, bark mulch.
Paul, is there a point at which, you might be better off to kind of start over or pull out those strawberry plants and kind of give it a year of rest, or maybe plant something that provides a little more competition for the weeds? I know that's common in agriculture.
Right. Now, I'm not a strawberry expert by any means. My focus is on more ornamental plants. But yeah, definitely whenever your patch is starting to get a little bit bare and you're starting to see a lot of weeds, it's time to maybe plant a patch somewhere else, let it go dormant, maybe go back to turf or something, or cover it completely with black landscape fabric, try to solarize it. There does come a point where you just kind of have to give up for a little bit.
Those are lovely recommendations, but this is a community garden and it's 4 huge strawberry fields, so I can't just let them go.
Okay.
You could do maybe a rotation where
I've done that too. Yes.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a hard situation.
Yeah. So as I said in my comment here, every year a different method. And this year I've just put down rhubarb because it's a very large leafy plant, and I hope that I'm going to shade them out. I mean, I'm trying everything. I thought maybe there's still some, mythical, mysterious, secret way to get rid of them. Bespeak them or something like that.
Alas.
Unfortunately, there isn't. I wish there was. The key to controlling weeds in any situation is not to rely just on one method, but to use an integrated approach. Use cultivation, use hand pulling. Try to exclude the weed seeds. Try to use things to reduce the soil disturbance, things like mulches as well, and don't just rely on any one method to do it all. Recommendations for removing hairy bittercress from a lawn. So hairy bittercress is winter annual that Kathy talked about. One of the things that you want to do to try to eliminate it is first, don't let it go to seed. So if it's in your lawn, you might have to mow your lawn before you typically mow the grass to try to cut off those flower stalks to prevent buildup of additional seeds. If you've already kind of missed that, you might want to do some hand pulling because it's very difficult to control with an herbicide, especially even if you're trying to use an organic herbicide in the spring. One thing to remember about winter annuals is that they actually germinate in the fall. Usually they start by late August. So if you can start looking for them then and control them when they're really small, you can get great control come spring. Corn gluten meal. So the research is conflicting on corn gluten meal. Iowa State originally published that information, but then other universities tried to duplicate their study and they were not able to get the same results. It shows that there is some potential to be a pre-emergent, but it's also a great nitrogen source. So it's kind of, okay, do I want to encourage growth or am I trying to suppress growth? So you hear a lot about corn gluten meal, but just know that the research is still out on that there's conflicting information on there. I like Mary Jo's question, is there a thistle bird feeder close by? If so, move it.
Any other questions? I'm posting the website again, and as I said, we should have this up, the recording of the presentation and the Q&A up by this afternoon. That usually goes pretty quickly, but give one more chance for any questions that are out there. I wish Kathy was here. She could share some more edible weed recipes. She's really into that. I know the person I was talking to before the session started. I would just about encourage you to reach out to her. She's done some pretty neat things with those. And yes, I don't know, Paul, have you got to sample some of her fine weed cooking?
I haven't, but she always shares recipes whenever she talks about invasives or weeds.
Yeah.
But it's only ever a picture. It's never, the actual sample. So
she does really do it.
Yes, I know she does.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Paul, for being here to help with the questions. So that was very valuable. There was a comment about the weed wrench, a similar tool to the weed wrench. So hopefully the person that asked about that saw that in the chat there. And I don't think the chat actually shows up on the recording. So if there's anything you want to pull from there, do it now. So again, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a delight to kind of have this discussion, and happy gardening, everyone. Get out there and enjoy the sunshine. Thank you.